this video is to look at the different ways of showing elements, compounds and mixtures in chemistry. So let's start off looking at elements. Elements can be found on the periodic table. So if the name is not on the periodic table, then it's not an element. All known elements are on the periodic table, and this includes quite a lot that are synthetic down the bottom. Now, the chemical symbol, we can recognise the symbol and we can give the different elements names, and you'll also be able to see that these chemical symbols can be combined together to make compounds, but more of that in a minute. So, our elements, they are found on the periodic table. Elements can be shown as little circles, so we can draw our elements as little circles, and we can say that these atoms are all the same type of atom. Now, these atoms are all separate, so these are monoatomic elements, so it's an element that's made up of just the one atom. This could be something like a Nobel gas. We can also have an element that is made up of more than one atom joined together. So here I've got diatomic elements, and you can see here that they've got molecules here, so it's a molecule because it's more than one atom joined together. So I've got my molecules, and each molecule is made up of two atoms, and they're the same type of atom, and I'm showing that by using the colour. I could also have an element that is, for example, a metal that has lots and lots of atoms that are all joined together in a lattice here. This is still an element because it's made up of only one type of atom. Again, I'm showing that by using the colour. So we can see that I've got just one type of atom making up my elements. Some examples of elements that you might come across. Examples could be things like oxygen. Oxygen is a diatomic element. It could be things like carbon. It could be things like hydrogen or sulfur or nitrogen. All of these are examples of elements, and you can find them on the periodic table, and you can find their chemical symbols on the periodic table. Next, we're going to look at compounds. So compounds are made up of more than one type of atom chemically joined together. So you cannot find them on the periodic table, or not their name as it is. So you cannot find on the periodic table. And examples, we might see something that looks like this. So here I've got an example of a compound, and we can see it's a compound because I have two different atoms that are joined together, and we show that they're joined together because they're touching each other. So they're chemically joined, they're touching each other, but they're all the same. It's all the same compound. So all of these different molecules here, the molecule being more than one atom joined together, all of those molecules are the same compound. I could have a different type of compound. So my different type of compound has got different types of atoms in it, and I can draw multiples of these, and again showing the different types of atoms by the different coloured circles. So here again I've got another compound. It doesn't matter that there's only one of the red atom and four of the yellow atoms, it's still a compound. Compounds can have multiple different types of atoms in. So for example, I could have a compound that is made up as a solid, and it could be alternating atoms from different types of atoms. And because we're drawing these as joined together, we can see that this has made a compound. So this could be an ionic compound, so an ionic lattice, so it could be something like a salt crystal, for example. So we can see again we've got a compound and it's got two different types of atoms in, but because of the way that they're joined together, we can say that they're touching each other and therefore they're chemically joined, and therefore we call it a compound, not a mixture of our elements. Compounds can also have more than two different types of atoms. So for example, here if I have this is another type of compound. So this one's got three different atoms in it. So we can see that we've got lots of different types of compounds. Again, we're showing that the compounds, that they're chemically joined together by the different circles touching each other, but there's space in between the different molecules. So we're repeating the same thing over and over again. Now, interestingly, if I drew this, it's the same as the two compounds above it. All we've done is we've rotated it in three-dimensional space. So I've done a little bit of a flip there. But because you could rotate it and it would look the same if you rotated it as the other ones above, we can say that it's the same compound. So examples of compounds. Examples of compounds are things like sodium chloride. We could have things like calcium carbonate. That's our marble. Okay, so things like carbon dioxide as well. That's another example. All of these different examples that we've got here of compounds, they've got two words in them. So these two words, they usually tell us the elements that are involved. So if we have a look here, I've got carbon and oxygen in carbon dioxide. Here I have sodium and chlorine. In calcium carbonate, I've got calcium and carbon, and the 8 means that there's oxygen involved as well. Sometimes you'll have a compound name that doesn't have more than one word, but if it's got more than one word in it and they're both chemical names, then you can say it's a compound. But if I've got something like water, well, water, it's only one word, but we can't find it on the periodic table, and we know that when we're looking at water, we're looking at all of the molecules being the same. So water is another example of a compound. Another example that you'll come across is methane. That's the gas that comes out of our gas taps. So methane again is an example of a compound. It's a pure substance, it's not a mixture. It is just, we don't use a double chemical name. So you need to be able to recognise elements and compounds from their drawings and from their names. So mixtures is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So this could be a mixture of elements, or it could be a mixture of compounds. So you need to be able to recognise both. What we can see is if I look at drawing some elements, so these are monatomic elements. Here I've got pure elements. As soon as I start adding that in, you see the different colour of atom, suddenly I have a mixture. This is not a compound because they're not chemically joined. So actually what I can do, you can see I can draw lines in between all of the different atoms. So that tells me that they're separated. Because they're separated, it's a mixture. I could separate these without doing any chemistry. So a mixture is where you've got different elements or different compounds that you can separate without having to do a chemical reaction. Other ways that you might see mixtures. So we might, for example, see if I've got my compounds here and I've got a couple of different compounds, and I need to draw just one more. Now that's the same, it's just been flipped the other way around, so you could rotate that and it would look the same as the other two examples of that compound. Now if I add this into the mix, you can see that I've got a mixture. I have different types of compounds, and these could be separated by chemical means. So here I've got another example of a mixture. Sometimes you can have a mixture of more than two different compounds. So for example, if I add this one on here, suddenly I've got a mixture of 3 different compounds. So examples of mixtures that you might come across are things like air. That's something that we come across. Milk is an example of a mixture. In fact, most of the things that we come across every day are mixtures. So things like orange juice, things like my cup of coffee. That's a mixture of mixtures because it's got milk and it's got sugar and it's got the coffee, which the coffee is itself a mixture of lots of different things. So mixtures, the important point being that they can be separated without having to break any chemical bonds, without having to do any chemistry. So in summary, elements, we find them on the periodic table. Compounds, they are elements that are chemically joined. Usually the name is 2 words, so usually a 2-word name. And then when we look at our mixtures, mixtures can be separated without doing chemistry, so without doing a chemical reaction.